Then suddenly, the British Home Office was issuing so-called domestic permits, whereby females could go to England and do nothing else but domestic work. It wasn't, perhaps this doesn't sound very grateful, it wasn't entirely altruistic of the English to do that. They had great problems to have servants because at that time they really exploited their maids. There was always that class distinction. And they really took terrible advantage of them as a rule and underpaid them so that slowly their own people didn't want to do domestic work anymore. And so this was a marvelous opportunity for them to import some servants. And meanwhile, of course, it saved my life. This quote captures many themes in the life narrations of those who escaped from the threat of fascism by becoming domestic servants in British homes. Lisa Hoffman was among the 20,000 emigres who came to the UK, the largest single block of refugees admitted to Great Britain during the 1930s, but a group whose stories have been largely ignored in the scholarship of the period and almost entirely forgotten in public memories of those times. Lisa Hoffman's explanation of British immigration policy highlights common threads in the testimonies of other refugee domestics: tensions between gratitude and bitterness, questioning the altruism of the British, commenting on the treatment of servants, and observations about class. I have listened to the recorded interviews of 300 such women, examining how they have remembered and framed their experiences as refugees and servants in British homes and exploring their marginalization both then and now. These testimonies come from the following collections. However, locating these testimonies has demonstrated to me just how overlooked refugee domestics have been. It has taken me over 3 years and countless hours of searching to find these testimonies. Based upon my previous research on the Kindertransport, I had thought that a few keyword searches would lead me to the relevant testimonies, but this was not the case. For example, the terms domestic, domestic service, and maid in the Shoah Foundation archive retrieve only references to the servants that survivors themselves employed. Domestic service visa and domestic service permit do not exist as keyword phrases in any of the collections I consulted. As Lisa Hoffman accurately noted, Jewish refugees were granted domestic visas because of a shortage of servants in the UK. As she surmised, this was in part due to class-based exploitation and underpayment, but there were also structural reasons for the so-called servant crisis of the interwar period, including the expanded opportunities of the First World War and a growing middle class which considered servant keeping a mark of their rising social status. The interwar servant crisis was investigated several times by Parliament and social reformers, but even the chronic shortage of servants did not induce employers to significantly alter their treatment of their domestics, for the same complaints appeared in every investigation. The Jewish women who were allowed into the UK to fill the servant gap arrived in large numbers only after the Anschluss and swelled after Kristallnacht. They entered British society at a time when its servant-keeping classes clung to their traditional models. 20,000 Jewish refugees were thus poised to escape their increasing marginalization in the German Reich by taking up work at the very margins of British life. It is impossible to understand how Jewish refugee domestics narrate their experiences without listening to their memories of growing up in pre-fascist Europe. The recollections of Susie Linton, a self-described pampered only child, and Gertrude Worelski, raised in a wealthy family, are typical of the often idealized recollections of growing up in the pre-Nazi era. Many refugee domestics shared similar backgrounds, and these significantly framed the way that they remembered and narrated their reception and treatment as maids in Great Britain. Although women aged 16 to 50 were accepted for domestic visas, the vast majority were single women born between 1913 and 1921. They came from both rural and urban places, were religiously observant and completely secular, but by a wide margin they came from middle-class assimilated families. Amongst the social economic strata, at least 75 of my research group reported growing up with residential maids, many in households that employed more than one servant. Additionally, quite a few of these women enjoyed regular vacations to seaside and mountains, They skated and skied in the winter and swam and played tennis in the summer. They had private schools, piano lessons, French governesses, went to theater and opera, wore fashionable clothing, and had professional aspirations. As a group, they could not have been less suited to the jobs that awaited them or less prepared for the diminished status of domestic service. They were often better educated, more widely traveled, better dressed, and more genteelly brought up than their British employers, throwing the disparity between their former lives and their lives as servants into high relief. The majority of former refugees spoke fondly and often at length about their own families' domestic staffs and emphasized the loyalty of their servants and their integration into family life. Marion Silverman recalled that her mother never did much work because they had a lady in the house, but she was not named a maid. She was like a member of the family. She stood with us for all the years until she had to leave. Many also spoke of the ways in which the servants were incorporated into the household. Inga Adler, who grew up in this large estate with maids, a manservant, and a chauffeur, recalled, "We had the most loveliest Christmases with a Christmas tree and the servants with us in the same room with the grandparents and the present giving." Dozens of women recalled similar scenes. A strong theme in these recollections is the positioning of the domestic staff within the circle of the family, and those memories were critical to refugee domestics' interpretations of their own experiences. The succinct assessment of Herta Grove represented the perceptions of many. "I was a real maid, not how our maids were in Germany, but I was a real maid." Herta's clear distinction between real maids and German maids was conditioned by memories of her, quote, absolutely wonderful Kinderfräulein, who remained loyal to Herta's widowed mother, quote, to the bitter end, and it signals her repositioning from the center to the periphery of family life. The loss of status associated with treatment as a real maid came as a shock to most refugee domestics. Carola Dumar, who was by her own account a spoiled brat, brought up by a beloved nanny, recalled, "I had to clean toilets, make beds, serve at the table, and here I was, the daughter of a lawyer, growing up the way I did, as a maid. That was extremely painful to me. I cried and cried and cried." Hildegard Hoffmann, a self-described spoiled Jewish princess, was hired as a nanny by a Jewish doctor's family and naively thought, "Isn't it wonderful? I'm going to meet everybody, and that's going to be like my adopted family." And all I did was serve. I wasn't included in anything. Even worse was having to do the rough, as scrubbing the front steps with chalkstone was called, and she confessed that in those early morning hours, with this menial, horrible task to do, I cried my eyes out every morning. The transition was no easier for older women, many of whom had enjoyed financial independence and satisfying careers in their pre-immigration lives. Anna Kalman and her identical twin Lilo had left business careers in Berlin and acutely felt their changed status, as Anne recalled. "I was continuously in tears, and of course, when they came home, they said, 'What, have you been crying again?' I had to kind of wash my eyes and contain myself, steel myself, not to let them see how you feel inside, because they felt, 'Look what we've done for her. She should be eternally grateful.'" Anne clearly resented her Jewish employers who thought that they were doing something for the Jews. They themselves were Jews, and showing me off as a refugee. I don't think it was kindness. I think it was more like, "Here, I'm doing something for the poor refugee from Germany." Not all refugee domestics felt ill-used, but even those who were treated more kindly commonly reported crippling loneliness and social isolation. Marion Friedlander, who worked for a Quaker family, recalled, "They were very nice people, but a servant is a servant, a maid is a maid. The food that was left over at the table, I and the dog, Tinker was his name, was for us in the kitchen. I sat in the kitchen crying, 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 and the dog was next to me, putting his paws on me and licking my tears. He was my best friend, that dog." Similarly, Trudy Biebring, who worked for a vicar and his wife, noted, "There was no social interaction. I had my meals in the kitchen. They had their meals in the lounge. She would talk to me when she came into the kitchen. She was very friendly, very nice, but never would she say, 'Join us.' With few exceptions, refugee domestics also recalled the physically taxing work, which was made more difficult by traditional attitudes towards housekeeping and the lack of household modernization, long felt unnecessary in a country with a seemingly inexhaustible supply of domestic servants. Inga Adler told of her first shock. Another Jewish girl came 2 weeks after I was there. She was used to working, and we two always laughed about it. But when I was alone, I did not laugh. I didn't know chamber pots existed. We all used a toilet in Germany. In addition to chamber pots, nothing bedeviled the refugee maids more than the British devotion to open coal-burning fireplaces and boilers. Marion Smith, who worked as a parlourmaid in a large manor house, while her mother worked as a domestic in a nearby house, recalled that her mother couldn't manage at all. She was lost in this house where she was supposed to light a fire. Never lit a fire. She had never seen anything like that in her life. We had central heating in Germany, and she was completely lost. Contrasting their modern continental households with the perceived backwardness of British domestic spaces, these women were able to separate themselves to some extent from the demeaning work that they were required to perform, and to retain a semblance of their former identities while adopting roles as common maids. Marion, like many, admitted that as a maid, I wasn't much good either. There was a certain pride in this refrain that emphasized the refugee domestics' belief in their unsuitability for the role of servant and their inability or refusal to become a good maid. Even more than the laborious work, primitive conditions, and social isolation, it was their employer's treatment that was felt most painfully. As Susie Linton recalled, "Clean the steps, get the breakfast ready, and start the washing. That's the way they talked to me. There was no personal contact, no sympathy, nothing. I found out that 2 or 3 refugee girls were all in the same boat. They all complained the same as I did, how badly treated we were. I wasn't frightened of the work. I was healthy. I was young. I didn't mind the work, but I did mind. I objected to the way I was treated." In a similar testimony, Helga Lermer, another self-confessed pampered only child, described a mistress who accused her of stealing, underfed her, and required her to use an outside toilet, and threatened to send her back to Germany. She admitted that she was not the best employee, quote, "but if they had treated me nicely, I might have been more ambitious to be a good maid." Like many, Helga's employer resorted to threats to keep her at her job. Others told of underpayment, docked wages, and the threat of a poor or withheld recommendation. When war broke out, Nellie Kuttner's employer decamped to the countryside with her children, but expected Nellie to stay on and look after the husband in the house for no pay. Nellie refused, but soon discovered she could not get another job without a reference. And when she returned to ask for one and pick up her luggage, the mistress, who had by then returned, flew into a rage and told Nellie that if she wanted her luggage, she would have to work for it. In that moment, I was thinking, from the Nazis, I have escaped from lying down to wash the pavement, and here I have to wash the floor. I took off my lovely silk stockings. I took off my silk dress, went up to the room, and did the floor. Equating their treatment in England with the humiliations imposed on Jews by the Nazis was another frame through which refugee maids narrated their lives. Soon after this episode, Nellie Kuttner had a complete nervous breakdown. Compounding her distress was the fact that her employers were Jewish, and like many former refugee domestics, she struggled to narrate the bitterness she felt over such treatment at the hands of co-religionists. About 40% of my research cohort worked in at least one Anglo-Jewish household, and over 2/3 of these placements were described in strikingly negative terms. Many former domestics ascribed this ill treatment to long-standing Ostjuden-Westjuden animosities, and some employers, like Hannah Graber's mistress, articulated these feelings explicitly. Hannah could not understand why her employer treated her so cruelly, and one day she finally had enough courage to ask, quote, "Mrs. Cohen, why are you so nasty to me?" And she turned around and said, "Because you German Jews were nasty to my forefathers, the Polish Jews." Significantly, Hannah and many others noted regretfully that their employers were right. As Hannah said, "It was true, I know, because I know the comments my grandmother used to make. The German Jews were very arrogant. I know that. They were not very nice to the Polish Jews." Not all testified negatively about their employers, and a few, like Felicitas Workshire, unequivocally praised them. She said her employers were, quote, sent from the heavens, and claimed that she actually enjoyed the work and that the family were her, quote, nearest and dearest friends. She avoided associating with fellow refugees who just talked about their terrible stories because the goals were, quote, so wonderful I didn't want to be miserable around them. However, the vast majority of Jewish domestics testified that they socialized only with fellow refugees. Many felt rejected by Anglo-Jewry, and their initial encounters within unequal power relationships of master and servant only exacerbated their distance. One of the most potent markers of this distance among my research group was that about 2/3 wed fellow refugees, showing their inability or unwillingness to bridge the differences that kept them apart from Anglo-Jewry and indeed British society at large. The testimonies of refugee domestics communicate implicitly and explicitly their emotional and psychic responses to living in exile. Carol Kuttner, an only child, went to work for a woman who was, quote, not nice. It has to be said, I was not treated nice. I was the most alone young lady you ever met. I was a very unhappy girl, more than unhappy. She concluded darkly, I wanted to forget the whole thing. Others, however, emphasized their agency and resilience. Even the most vulnerable learned from their experiences, and many eventually secured more favorable placements. After Nellie Kuttner recovered from her nervous breakdown, she entered the household of an elderly non-Jewish man and his spinster daughter. There she was treated as a valued member of the household, which restored her equilibrium. Marion Friedlander, whose only friend was the dog Tinker, eventually found work with a kindly German Jewish family where she, quote, felt like a daughter. Testimonies like these implicitly describe being pulled back into the center of the family life and demonstrate the immense significance of employers' treatment in restoring the refugee domestic's sense of self. Lily Crew, who was unhappy in her own domestic job, communicated this when she spoke of the comfort she found in visiting a fellow refugee maid. She was part of the family. She was one of them. To me, to go there, oh, it was lovely. You really felt like a mensch again. Echoing this theme, Carol Kuttner, the woman who had hinted at suicidal thoughts in England, emigrated to New York in 1940, and after another period of demeaning domestic work, married and took an office job. Describing this moment, she proclaimed, I worked no more in people's houses. I was out of people's houses. I was a human being again. Though she was quite forthcoming in her interview, Carol Kuttner still suggested that much remained unspoken. Before her marriage, she had endured a lonely existence in New York that she was reluctant to discuss in detail. I really still had nobody. I was totally alone, and people will take advantage of other people when they are totally alone. There's things here that none of my family know, so I don't know if I will ever tell. It was sad, okay? I was being used left and right, but I was just happy for anybody who could give me some comfort. Carol never elaborated on the ways in which she was used, but it's not difficult to intuit her meaning. Other interviewees admitted that they dealt with their painful past by deliberately forgetting much about their refugee experiences, and some found no opening in their interviews to reveal the deepest parts of their past. One of these was Lieselot Berghausen, who fell in love with her employer, a Jewish refugee whose wife had not managed to get out of Germany. Anticipating that the wife was lost in the maelstrom, Lieselot and her lover planned to marry after the war, but fate intervened and the wife survived, leaving Lieselot heartbroken and alone. The story of her tragic romance, however, does not surface in her recorded testimony, and I only learned it from her daughter, who I met quite by chance. Surprised to learn that her mother's testimony omitted this traumatic episode, she recalled her mother being very unhappy that the interviewer, quote, did not ask the right questions. This example highlights just one aspect of the interviewing process that affected survivors' ability to tell their entire stories, and I encountered such issues throughout the entire range of interviews consulted for this study. Former domestics were often interviewed by those who were unfamiliar with domestic service and seemed little interested in the lives of either refugees or maids. Interviewers representing organizations eager to record Holocaust testimony commonly communicated this disinterest by cutting off or redirecting interviewees once the narrative reached the point of domestic service in Britain. A striking example of this interrogatory suppression occurred during Lisa Hoffman's Yale Fortunoff testimony. Describing the moment of her arrival in Britain, she declaimed rather dramatically, "The chauffeur drove me to a God-forsaken place. It looked like a ruin, and that's when my troubles really started." Providing an opening that begged the question, what happened next, Lisa was instead redirected to the moment she left Germany and asked to discuss the family she left behind. These intrusive and all too common interruptions powerfully signaled interviewers' preferences for stories of Nazi persecution and communicated that refugee domestics' own stories were less valuable than the stories of those who suffered and perished on the continent. This implicit devaluing of the refugee domestic experience parallels their nearly complete absence in wider British pre-war and wartime memories. This silence has had a profound impact on the ways in which they narrate their lives and has blunted their ability to unequivocally possess their own very real trauma and suffering. There is no clearer evidence of refugee domestics' own feelings of ambiguity within narratives of survival than the Yad Vashem page of testimony that Eva Feist filled out for her mother who was murdered in the Holocaust. Below the box asking if the submitter is a survivor of the Shoah, Eva wrote, "April 1939, I escaped to England as a maid. Do you consider me a Shoah survivor?" To conclude, former refugee domestics' stories add a rich and important chapter to the history of the interwar and wartime period and deserve to be told. Denied widespread recognition then, they volunteered to tell their stories later when the public was more receptive to narratives of survival. But even this massive testimony has failed to provide the necessary traction for the history of refugee domestics to emerge. Even in their acts of testimony giving, they were often thwarted by the ignorance of interviewers and institutional disinterest in the lives and experiences of refugee maids. Nevertheless, hundreds have told their stories, recording for posterity not only the shock, alienation, and drudgery of their lives as servants and foreigners, but their agency, mastery, and reintegration as they got out of people's houses and became human again. Thank you.